In June 1947, somewhere in the Strait of Malacca, the signal starts without warning, no preamble, no call sign, just Morse code punching out of the static, and a radio operator on an American merchant vessel leaning forward in his chair because what he's hearing doesn't make sense. He writes it down. SOS from Ourang Medan. We float. All officers, including the captain, dead. Lying in the chart room and on the bridge. Possibly the whole crew died. He reads it back to himself. Then he reads it again. Then the frequency goes to noise. A burst of Morse that no one on any receiving vessel can decode. Dots and dashes that carry no meaning, or carry a meaning that's disintegrating as it's being sent. 30 seconds, maybe 40, of signal that sounds like someone trying to finish a sentence they no longer have the strength to complete. And then, clean and clear, 2 final words punch through. I die. Silence. Not static. Not interference. Not a frequency drop. Just nothing. The channel stays open and empty, the way a room stays open and empty after someone has left it suddenly, and you're not yet sure they've gone. That silence travels across the water to every vessel within range. It reaches the Silver Star first. The Strait of Malacca is not a romantic stretch of ocean. There is nothing dramatic about it from the outside. It is 550 miles of narrow, shallow, brutally hot seawater, pinched between the western edge of the Malay Peninsula and the northeastern coast of Sumatra. At its tightest point, near Singapore, it is less than 2 miles wide. The whole world's trade moves through it. It always has. Spice routes, colonial supply lines, oil tankers, cargo ships. The strait is less a body of water than a corridor, a throat. And in June of 1947, 2 years after the end of the most destructive war in human history, that corridor was busier than it has ever been. Ships of a dozen nations are moving through it daily, carrying goods that are never fully declared to ports that are barely recovered from occupation. A signal sent here does not go unheard. The strait is too trafficked for silence. Within minutes of those final 2 words, receiving stations operated by the Dutch, the British, and the Americans are all working the same problem. Triangulating the source, cross-referencing the position, identifying the vessel, the ship's name. Once they have it, translates from Malay as Man of Medan. Medan being a city on the northern coast of Sumatra, visible on a clear day from the middle of the strait. A Sumatran ship, a Dutch colonial registry, a crew that, according to its own distress signal, is either dying or already dead. The Silver Star, a 6,500-ton American merchant vessel owned by Grace Lines of New York, is the closest ship to the coordinates, 19 hours away at full steam. Its captain changes course immediately. For 19 hours, the Silver Star's radio operator tries to raise the Ourang Medan on every frequency. Nothing comes back. Not a voice. Not a tap. Not even a carrier signal to confirm the transmitter is still running. The ship is out there. The coordinates were triangulated from multiple stations. The position is reasonably certain. But it is radiating nothing. Not distress, not silence with intention, just absence. There are questions you cannot stop asking when you are 19 hours away from a ship that transmitted those words and then went quiet. If the whole crew is dead, who sent the last message? If someone was alive long enough to transmit "I die," why didn't they try to start an engine, drop anchor, reach a lifeboat? Why did the last conscious person on that vessel spend their final seconds at a transmitter instead of trying to survive? There is an answer to that question, but it takes another 19 hours to arrive. The Silver Star spots the Ourang Medan at dawn. She is floating. That's the first thing. She is upright. She is intact. She shows no visible damage. To her hull, a slight list to starboard, which could mean uneven cargo load, could mean coal burn-off, could mean a dozen ordinary things. From a distance, in the early light, she looks like a ship that has simply stopped. Her chimney is cold. No smoke. The propeller is still. No flag is flying. The Silver Star circles her at several hundred meters, sounding its horn repeatedly, watching for movement on the deck. There is none. A megaphone brings no response. A second pass brings no response. The captain of the Silver Star makes the call. Launch the boats. First officer, 9 men. Go across and find out what happened. One detail stops them before they even board. On the starboard side, at the lifeboat David, one of the ship's lifeboats is missing. Gone. But the lines are still hanging. The block and tackle are still attached. The ropes trailing down toward the waterline, unsecured. Not lowered cleanly, not released properly. Something happened at that davit, and whoever was there either didn't finish what they started or didn't need to. The boarding party notes it, files it away, climbs over the rail. The first corridor below deck stops them cold. Not figuratively. The air coming up from below is wrong. It is noticeably, unnaturally cold in a way that makes no physical sense when the sea temperature is above 80 degrees and the tropical sun has been on that hull since dawn. Several men later describe it independently. A chill. A deep, specific, sourceless chill. And then the bodies. The first one is a deckhand. On his back. Arms slightly raised, hands open, fingers spread. Eyes wide open and aimed at the ceiling. Mouth open. Face locked in an expression that takes a moment to name because it doesn't look like pain, it doesn't look like surprise. It looks like the last moment before a scream that never came out. No wound, no blood, no bruising, nothing broken, nothing torn. Just a man lying on the floor of a ship looking at something above him that the living men standing over him cannot see. They push further in. Every room is the same. What killed every person on this ship? The captain, the officers, the crew, the dog, with no mark on any of them, no chance to flee, no time to fight back, is a question this ship was designed by someone to never answer. We are going to answer it anyway. Here is the problem. When investigators go looking for the SS Ourang Medan, not the mystery, not the legend, not the story, but the actual ship, the registered vessel, the thing made of steel that should appear in the bureaucratic record of every port it ever entered, every flag it ever flew, every ton of cargo it ever declared, they find nothing. Not incomplete records, not damaged archives, not a file marked classified or restricted or missing in transit, nothing. The Lloyd's Register of Shipping, the authoritative catalog of every seagoing merchant vessel operating in the world, maintained continuously since 1764, consulted by every port authority, insurance underwriter, and maritime court on the planet, has no entry for a ship called the Ourang Medan, the Dictionary of Disasters at Sea, 1824 to 1962, which documents maritime casualties with meticulous bureaucratic thoroughness, does not record her sinking. The Dutch Maritime Archives in Amsterdam, which should hold. The registration documents for any vessel sailing under Dutch colonial authority in the East Indies show nothing. The Maritime Authority in Singapore, one of the busiest ports in the strait, the natural destination for any ship in distress in those waters, drew a blank when asked. A ship carrying a full crew sailed into one of the most trafficked waterways on Earth, transmitted a distress signal received by multiple vessels, and at least 3 national listening posts, was boarded by an American rescue party, and then exploded and sank. And officially, it never existed. A British writer named Roy Bainton spent years trying to find it. Bainton was a serious researcher, not a paranormal hobbyist, not someone chasing UFOs and ghost ships for magazine column inches. He was a maritime history writer who had encountered the Ourang Medan story and wanted to either confirm it or kill it cleanly. He went to Amsterdam. He contacted Singapore. He filed queries with Dutch colonial or maritime records. Every door he knocked on opened onto an empty room. He was, by his own account, close to writing the whole thing off as a seafarer's yarn. The kind of story that gets passed around in dockside bars until it calcifies into legend. When a letter arrives. It was from a retired German academic named Professor Theodor Seersdorfer of Essen, who had read a plea Bainton had placed in Sea Breezes, a British magazine read primarily by old sailors and maritime historians. Seersdorfer had been investigating the Ourang Medan for 45 years. 45 years. Longer than most careers. He had been tracking the paper trail of this story since before Roy Bainton was old enough to go to sea. And what he had found was not proof of a hoax and not proof of an incident. It was something more frustrating than either. It was a trail, partial, contradictory, and pointing in multiple directions at once. But a trail. Here is what the trail looks like. The earliest known version of the story appears not in 1947, but in 1940. An Italian publication called Sept Jours runs a story that September under the headline, "After 20 months, the mystery of the Ourang Medan is solved." The wording is telling. 20 months prior would place the incident in early 1939, or possibly during the opening months of the war. This version describes a former convict transport ship sold to smugglers, carrying a survivor who washed ashore and told his story before dying. The chemicals are already in this version. Nitroglycerin, potassium cyanide, sulfuric acid. The broad architecture of the story is already intact. Then nothing. For 8 years. Then, in February 1948, a Dutch-Indonesian newspaper called De Locomotief publishes the first of 3 articles on the incident. 3 separate pieces, across 3 issues, February 3rd, February 28th, and March 13th. The source is identified as a journalist named Silvio Shirley, based in Trieste, who claims to have obtained the account from a survivor found by missionaries on an island in the Marshall Islands. The De Locomotief editors are not fully convinced by their own story. They append a note to the final installment that reads, essentially, "We cannot verify any of this. Our source insists it is true. Draw your own conclusions." Then, in May 1952, the incident appears in the Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council, a publication of the United States Coast Guard, an American government publication, not a tabloid, not a paranormal magazine, the Coast Guard. The entry is brief, it does not reach a verdict, but it records the incident as something worth documenting. Someone in an official American maritime institution looked at this story and decided it belonged in the record. And then, in 1954, a German writer named Otto Mielke publishes a booklet titled Das Totenschiff in der Südsee, Death Ship in the South Sea. Mielke does not traffic in ambiguity. His booklet contains specific details. The date of the incident, June 1947. The name of the captain. The route the ship was sailing. The contents of the cargo hold. And crucially, Mielke's account is later said to have been authenticated by a crew member of the Silver Star, someone who was actually on the rescue vessel, who read the booklet and confirmed its account of events. That rescue vessel, at least, is real. The Silver Star's existence has been one of the story's most contested points, because no one chasing the Ourang Medan could initially find it in shipping records either. But the Silver Star did exist. It simply didn't exist under that name for long. It was originally launched as the Santa Cecilia by the Grace Line Shipping Company. In 1946, the United States Maritime Commission requisitioned it and briefly renamed it the Silver Star. In 1947, the exact year of the incident, the Grace Line reacquired it and renamed it again, this time the Santa Juana, under which name it sailed until it was scrapped in 1971. The window in which a ship called the Silver Star existed and was operating in those waters is narrow. It fits the timeline almost perfectly, which means the Ourang Medan story, whatever else it is not built entirely on invented vessels. At least one of its ships was real, in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Then there is the CIA. In 1959, a document filed within American intelligence channels references the SS Ourang Medan and its circumstances. It does not explain the incident. It does not declassify anything. It simply references it in the way that intelligence documents reference things that have come to the attention of people who track certain kinds of information, the kind of people who care about what was being moved across Southeast Asian waters in the chaotic aftermath of a world war. The kind of people who would have very specific reasons to care about an unregistered ship carrying undeclared cargo that killed its entire crew and then conveniently exploded before anyone could examine it. That document is not proof of anything, but it is a government noticing. A ship that officially never existed. So here is where we land at the end of the paper trail. The story was first told in wartime Italy in 1940. It was retold in post-war Dutch-Indonesian press in 1948. It was documented by the United States Coast Guard in 1952. It was detailed in a German publication in 1954. It was referenced in American intelligence files in 1959. Each version contains the same core elements: the distress signal, the dead crew, the frozen expressions, the fire, the explosion, the sinking. Each version changes certain details: dates, locations, names, survival accounts. The changes are not random. Each version of the story was told in a specific political context, for a specific audience, at a specific moment in history: wartime Italy, post-war colonial press, Cold War America. These are not neutral contexts. Stories get shaped by the pressures of the moment they're told in. Details get adjusted. Certain things get emphasized. Certain things, cargo manifests, ship registries, the names of the people responsible for loading a hold with chemicals that shouldn't have been there, get quietly left out. Roy Bainton, after everything, concluded he was probably looking at a real event. A ship, possibly sailing under a different name for most of its existence, that took on the name Ourang Medan for a single voyage, and then ceased to exist as anything official when it went down. A ship that someone had very deliberate reasons to keep out of the record. The deaths on that ship were not a mystery to everyone. Someone knew exactly what was in that hold, and the evidence for what that was, the kind of evidence that would explain every body, every expression, every symptom, every frozen face turned up toward the sun, is waiting in the next chapter. It is sitting in the cargo hold, right below where the dead men are, lying. Let's go back to the ship. Not the legend of it, not the theory of it, the physical reality of what 11 men from the Silver Star walked into when they climbed over that rail and moved through those corridors in the early morning heat of the Strait of Malacca. Because before you can understand what killed the crew of the Ourang Medan, you have to sit with what was actually found. Room by room. Body by body. Detail by detail. This is not a ghost story. It's a crime scene. And crime scenes speak if you're willing to listen carefully enough. The boarding party moves in tight, first officer leading, 9 men behind him. They've boarded distressed vessels before. That's part of what merchant crews do. Maritime law is clear on the obligation. But nothing in anyone's training prepares you for the specific quality of silence on a ship that should have 40 men moving around it. Ships are loud, engines, ventilation, footsteps on metal decking, the constant ambient noise of a working vessel. The Ourang Medan has none of it. What the boarding party steps into is the silence of a place where all mechanical and human activity has ceased simultaneously. Not gradually, not one system failing after another, all of it at once. The cold hits them before they reach the first body. Multiple members of the boarding party report it independently, in separate accounts without apparent coordination. A chill coming up from below decks, distinct, and source less. The outside air temperature is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun has been on the steel hull for hours. By every law of physics governing a metal vessel sitting in tropical waters, the interior of that ship should be an oven. Instead, cold. A deep, specific cold that several men describe as the kind you feel in your chest before you feel it on your skin. We will come back to that cold, because it is not incidental. It is a clue that most accounts of this story bury in the atmosphere when it should be treated as evidence. The first body is a deckhand, found in the forward corridor, on his back. Arms raised slightly from the floor, hands open, fingers spread apart, not clenched, not grabbing at anything, just open, wide open. The way hands look when someone is trying to push something away, or trying to stop something that cannot be stopped with hands. His eyes are fully open, aimed at the ceiling above him. His mouth is open. His face is set, locked, the boarding party will say later, in an expression that takes a moment to classify because it doesn't fit the categories men use for the expressions of the dead. It's not painful. Pain on a dead face looks a specific way. Contracted muscles, clenched jaw, furrowed brow. This isn't that. It's not surprising. Surprise is open, but loose, momentary. This is something held, something that arrived and didn't leave, the closest word, the word that keeps appearing in every account, in every language these accounts were recorded in, is terror. Not the experience of being frightened, the arrival point of something beyond fright. A face that got to the last moment before a scream and froze there, and there is no mark on him. None. No wound, no bruising, no abrasion. His clothing is undisturbed. There is no blood anywhere in the corridor, no sign that he fell. The position of his body suggests he was already on his back when whatever happened reached him or went down so fast he couldn't break his own fall. They leave him and move forward. Every room is the same. The officers are dead in the chart room. The captain is dead on the bridge. His position, his posture, identical to the deckhand in the corridor. On his back. Eyes up. Mouth open. Arms slightly raised. The radio operator is dead at his station, in his chair, with one hand near the transmitter. This is the man who sent those words. I die. He is dead exactly where he sat when he sent them, which means he knew, with enough clarity to transmit, with enough purpose to choose those two words over any others, that he was in the process of dying, and there was nothing he could do about it. Think about that for a moment. He didn't run. He didn't try to reach the deck, the fresh air, or a lifeboat. In the last seconds of his life, he chose to stay at that transmitter and tell someone what was happening, either because leaving would not have saved him, or because he was already past the point where leaving was possible. The dog is dead on the deck near the stern. Same presentation. Mouth open, legs rigid, eyes fixed. Animals don't perform. They don't hold expressions for the benefit of witnesses. What is on that dog's face is what was on that dog's face in the last moment of its life, unrehearsed, unembellished. And it matches humans exactly. That single detail, the dog, closes off an entire category of explanation. Any theory that requires human psychology, human fear response, human perception of something terrifying, a threat, a hallucination, an attacker, cannot explain the dog. The dog died the same way, in the same posture, wearing the same expression. Whatever came for this crew was not selective. It did not require a nervous system sophisticated enough to feel dread. It came through the air, or through the ventilation, or up from below, and it took everything alive on that ship with the same indifferent efficiency. No injuries. This keeps coming back, and it deserves more weight than it typically receives. When people die violently, they leave evidence. When they are attacked, they defend themselves. Broken fingernails, bruised forearms, torn clothing. When they fight each other, the evidence is mutual and obvious. When they die of most conventional causes at sea, drowning, dehydration, starvation, the body shows it. When they die of most mechanical failures, a boiler explosion, a structural collapse, the environment shows it. The ship shows damage. Objects are displaced. The geometry of the space changes. The Ourang Medan shows none of this. The ship is structurally sound. The cargo appears undisturbed. No furniture is overturned. No equipment is smashed. No door has been forced. The only physical anomaly, besides the bodies themselves, is the missing lifeboat on the starboard davit. Those lines still hanging. That absence still unexplained. What this pattern of evidence describes, or rather, what this nearly total absence of conventional evidence describes, is a death that came from the inside out, not something that struck the crew, something the crew breathed. Let's talk about what that means forensically. There are 3 agents capable of producing the scene the boarding party walked into. 3 that fit every element of the physical evidence. The postures, the expressions, the lack of injury, the speed, the universality of the deaths across the entire crew. The first is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, and kills silently. It binds to hemoglobin in the blood roughly 200 times more efficiently than oxygen does, meaning a relatively low concentration will rapidly displace all functional oxygen in the bloodstream. Death from carbon monoxide poisoning can be remarkably fast at high concentrations. The muscle tone at death can produce rigid, fixed body positions. It would explain why no one could flee. By the time you understand what's happening, your muscles are no longer reliably under your control. But carbon monoxide poisoning has a signature. The blood and the skin turns a characteristic cherry red, cherry pink. It is one of the most distinctive post-mortem presentations in forensic pathology. The boarding party makes no mention of unusual skin coloration on any of the bodies. Carbon monoxide also doesn't explain the cold. It doesn't explain the accelerated decomposition several accounts note. And critically, it doesn't fully explain the expressions. Carbon monoxide death, while fast and cruel, tends to produce a presentation closer to sleep than to frozen terror. The second is hydrogen cyanide. This is where the physical evidence gets uncomfortably precise in its fit. Hydrogen cyanide, HCN, doesn't work like most poisons. It doesn't simply shut down one system. It attacks at the cellular level, blocking an enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase, which is responsible for the final step of cellular respiration, the process by which every cell in your body converts oxygen into usable energy. Cyanide poisoning, at sufficient concentration, is effectively cellular suffocation. Every cell in the body simultaneously loses the ability to use oxygen. The mitochondria stop. The heart, the brain, the muscles. Everything shuts down at once, from the inside. The speed is what matters here. At high atmospheric concentration, hydrogen cyanide kills in seconds to minutes, not gradually, not with a progression of symptoms that gives the body time to react, adapt, try to escape. Simply stops everything, which would explain the positions. The man at his transmitter, the captain on his bridge, the deckhand in the corridor. They didn't fall down because they were overcome gradually. They stopped in the middle of whatever they were doing because every cell in their body simultaneously lost the ability to function. And the expressions, hydrogen cyanide, at the concentration required to kill a ship full of people this fast, causes severe terminal convulsions. Violent whole-body seizures in the final seconds of consciousness. The face, at the moment of death, can lock into precisely the frozen, wide-eyed, open-mouthed expression described by every single person who boarded that ship. Not an expression of witnessed horror, an expression of catastrophic neurological shutdown at the moment of maximum physiological distress. The third candidate is a nerve agent. Post-war Southeast Asia in 1947 was, and this cannot be overstated, swimming in undisposed chemical and biological weapons. Japanese, German, and to a lesser extent Allied stockpiles were scattered across the Pacific theater, inadequately cataloged, irregularly stored, and in many cases actively being moved by parties with reasons to keep those movements quiet. Nerve agents, organophosphate compounds, the same class as the G-series agents developed by Germany during the war, produce a death that is fast, total, and leaves no external mark. They work by preventing the breakdown of acetylcholine at nerve junctions, causing continuous nerve firing, muscle rigidity, seizure, and respiratory failure. The expression produced at death is consistent with what was found. The speed is consistent. The universality across all crew members is consistent. And nerve agents, depending on how they are stored and what they are stored near, can interact with seawater in the hull of a leaking ship to produce volatile, heavier-than-air gases that settle into lower decks and move silently through ventilation systems before anyone knows they are there. Now, the cold. This is the detail that doesn't fit neatly into any single theory, and it is the detail that most serious researchers have failed to adequately explain. A distinct, unnatural, sourceless cold coming up from below decks in a tropical environment. Several boarding party members reported independently. Here is what produces cold in a chemical reaction: endothermic processes. Chemical reactions that absorb heat from the surrounding environment rather than releasing it. Certain combinations of compounds, particularly involving evaporation of cryogenic agents or specific salt reactions, produce dramatic, localized temperature drops. If the cargo hold of the Ourang Medan contained certain chemical compounds that had begun interacting with each other, or with seawater entering through a compromised hull, the resulting reaction could have simultaneously produced toxic gas and dropped the ambient temperature in the lower decks by enough degrees to be distinctly felt by men coming from 100-degree tropical air. The cold is not atmospheric. The cold is chemistry. Here is what the bodies said, assembled into a single statement. Something came through that ship fast. Fast enough to take the radio operator mid-transmission and leave him in his chair. Fast enough to take the captain on his bridge and leave him exactly where he stood. Fast enough that nobody reached the deck, nobody reached a lifeboat, nobody reached any space with fresh air that might have bought them another minute. It came from below. It was invisible. It left no mark. And it produced, at the moment of maximum concentration, a physiological event violent enough to lock every face on that ship into an expression of absolute terminal distress. The dog confirms it wasn't a human threat. The cold confirms it was chemical. The speed confirms it was catastrophic. The missing lifeboat confirms that at least one person, maybe more, knew early enough to try to get away. Whether they made it is a story for the next chapter. But first, we need to go below, into the hold, into the thing nobody was supposed to find. To understand what was loaded onto the Ourang Medan, you first have to understand the world it was sailing through. June 1947. The Second World War has been over for less than 2 years. That sounds like enough time for the world to have composed itself, to have sorted through the wreckage and filed everything neatly back into peacetime categories. It wasn't. Not even close. What the end of that war actually produced, particularly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, was not ordered. It was a vast, ungoverned dispersal of the most dangerous materials human beings had ever manufactured, moving across oceans on ships that had every reason to avoid official scrutiny. Think about the scale of it. 6 years of industrialized warfare across 2 hemispheres had generated chemical weapons stockpiles, biological research materials, nerve agents, and experimental compounds in quantities that had never existed before in history. Germany had developed the first true nerve agents, Taben, Sarin, Somen, and manufactured them by the ton. Japan had spent the war running one of the most savage and covert biological weapons programs ever documented. The Americans, the British, the Soviets, all had their own programs, their own stockpiles, their own materials they were not prepared to publicly account for in the sudden glare of peacetime. When the war ended, nobody had a clean plan for any of it. Some were destroyed. Some was dumped into the ocean. The Americans alone disposed of hundreds of thousands of tons of chemical munitions into the sea in the years immediately following the war. Much of it undocumented, much of it in the waters of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Some were transported, quietly, on unregistered vessels, through shipping lanes where the post-war chaos of decolonization and political realignment provided enough noise to move things without too many questions being asked. The Strait of Malacca, in the summer of 1947, was exactly the kind of corridor where that movement happened. Now meet Unit 731. Most people who know this name know it in outline. The Japanese Imperial Army's Covert Biological and Chemical Warfare Research Division, operating out of a compound in Pingfang, Manchuria. Its full designation was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Its actual function was something the modern world has never fully come to terms with: the systematic use of living human beings as experimental subjects for the development of biological and chemical weapons. Under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 conducted experiments on prisoners of war, Chinese, Russian, American, British, Australian, that have no parallel in documented history outside of the Nazi medical programs running simultaneously in Europe. Plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, introduced directly into living bodies to study progression and lethality. Vivisection without anesthesia. Pressure experiments. Frostbite research conducted by freezing living limbs. The development of ceramic bombs designed to disperse plague-infected fleas over civilian populations. Historians estimate the death toll from Unit 731's activities at somewhere between 3,000 and 250,000, depending on the scope of operations counted. The true number will never be known with certainty because of what happened at the end of the war. In August 1945, As Soviet forces advanced toward Manchuria, Ishii ordered the complete destruction of the Pingfang compound. All records were burned. All remaining prisoners, approximately 300, were killed. The 600 Chinese and Manchurian laborers who had built and maintained the facility were shot. Skeleton crews of Japanese troops blew up the buildings. Ishii issued potassium cyanide to his own officers, to be used if captured. He ordered every member of the unit to, in his exact words, take the secret to the grave. Then he went to Tokyo and negotiated his own immunity from war crimes prosecution by handing the accumulated research data of his program, every result, every finding, everything learned from those deaths, to American military intelligence. General Douglas MacArthur's staff accepted the offer. Ishii was never charged. The data was absorbed into American biological warfare research. The weapons themselves, the physical stockpiles, the compounds, the remaining materials from 6 years of production, were another matter entirely. Some were documented and destroyed under American supervision. Some were dumped into the sea off the Chinese coast, a practice that continued for years. And some, according to multiple historical accounts of the post-war Pacific, were moved, transported, put on ships and sent somewhere. Where those ships went and what names they sailed under is in many cases unknown. In 1954, a German writer named Otto Mielke published his booklet on the Ourang Medan. Among the specific details Mielke provides, and this is the detail that serious researchers keep returning to, is the contents of the cargo hold: potassium cyanide, nitroglycerin, sulfuric acid. These 3 compounds sitting together in the hold of a ship are not just dangerous. They are a specific kind of danger that produces a specific sequence of events that maps almost perfectly onto everything the boarding party found. Here is the chemistry, stated as plainly as possible. Potassium cyanide, KCN, is a white crystalline solid. In dry conditions, in sealed containers, it is relatively stable. The moment it comes into contact with any acidic solution, including seawater, which carries dissolved carbon dioxide that makes it mildly acidic, it begins to release hydrogen cyanide gas, HCN, the gas discussed in the previous chapter. The gas kills at the cellular level rapidly, without leaving a mark, producing the exact terminal presentation found on every body in every room of the Ourang Medan. If the hull of that ship had been compromised, a crack, a seam opened by the stress of rough water, the kind of minor structural damage that an old, poorly maintained, unofficially registered tramp steamer might accumulate without anyone logging it. Seawater entering the hold would begin that reaction, slowly at first, then faster as the concentration of gas built up, rising through the ship, moving through the ventilation system, heavier than air, so settling into lower decks first, then moving upward as concentration increased. The crew in the lower levels would have been first, then the upper decks, the officers on the bridge, last because they were highest, because the gas would take the longest to reach them in lethal concentration. But there is no safe level on a ship with no means of escape and no warning. The nitroglycerin explains the explosion. Nitroglycerin is extraordinarily sensitive to heat and shock. In stable conditions, in properly designed transport containers, it can be moved relatively safely. In improperly stowed containers on a working ship in tropical waters, surrounded by other reactive compounds, and subject to the vibration and temperature fluctuation of a vessel at sea, it is a catastrophe waiting to find its trigger. When the boarding party from the Silver Star attempted to take the Ourang Medan under tow, when they connected the lines and the ship began to move, it began to be subject to new stresses and vibrations. Whatever remaining stability the nitroglycerin in that hold had maintained was gone. The explosion that witnesses described as lifting the ship from the water before it sank is consistent with a nitroglycerin detonation below the waterline, not a fire that caused an explosion that caused the fire, fast, total, and, from the perspective of anyone who wanted the contents of that hold to remain unknown, perfectly timed. The cold in the lower decks, that sourceless chill that stopped the boarding party in mere. The first corridor is consistent with the endothermic phase of the cyanide reaction. When potassium cyanide dissolves in an acidic solution and begins releasing hydrogen cyanide gas, the reaction absorbs heat from the surrounding environment. In a confined space, a ship's hold, a corridor running above it, this produces a measurable, noticeable temperature drop. Not dramatic enough to see, dramatic enough to feel if you're walking from 100-degree tropical air into the space above a hold where that reaction has been running long enough to saturate the lower decks. The cold was the reaction breathing. But here is where the chemistry alone doesn't fully answer the question. Potassium cyanide, nitroglycerin, and sulfuric acid are not a normal commercial cargo combination. They have no legitimate reason to be together on a single vessel. They are not complementary industrial materials that might be co-shipped for efficiency. They are individually among the most tightly regulated materials in international shipping, or they were becoming so in the post-war regulatory environment of the late 1940s. Together, they represent a cargo that no registered shipping company, no insured vessel, no port authority willing to sign the manifest would have permitted. Which means whoever loaded that hold onto the Ourang Medan was operating entirely outside the official system. The survivor account, the man found dying on a Pacific island, claiming to be the second officer, his name given in various accounts as Jerry Rabbit, adds a layer that's impossible to verify but impossible to fully dismiss. According to his account, as told to a missionary before his death, the ship took on approximately 15,000 crates of unknown cargo at multiple Chinese ports before sailing. He examined the ship's logbook when his suspicions were raised by crew members becoming ill and found listed sulfuric acid, cyanide, nitroglycerin. He confronted the captain. He was dismissed. When men began dying and the captain recorded the cause as heart attacks, he understood what was happening and what was in the hold, and he got off the ship on the missing starboard lifeboat before the gas reached the upper decks. This account has never been confirmed, but its structural details, the Chinese ports, the undeclared cargo, the specific chemicals, align with what Mielke documented independently in 1954. Two sources, different origins, same chemicals. Now the question that the chemistry raises but cannot answer by itself: who owned that cargo? In 1947, there were exactly 3 categories of entity with access to the specific combination of compounds allegedly on the Ourang Medan, the motive to move them covertly, and the operational capacity to do so on an unregistered vessel through the Strait of Malacca. The first category, private smugglers operating in the post-war criminal economy of Southeast Asia. The war had created enormous black markets for industrial, chemicals, repurposed weapons materials, and unregulated substances of all kinds. An unregistered ship with a compliant or expendable crew was the standard vessel for this kind of operation. The second category, remnant networks connected to Japan's wartime military-industrial complex. Unit 731 and its affiliated programs had produced enormous quantities of chemical compounds that were scattered across the Pacific at war's end. Not all of it went to MacArthur's intelligence teams. Some were moved by former military figures operating in the post-war chaos of a collapsing empire. The Japanese Imperial Army, in its final months, had been dispersing assets across its former territories in ways that were never fully documented. The Strait of Malacca ran directly adjacent to what had been Japanese-occupied territory until 2 years earlier. The third category, the one the CIA document makes quietly relevant, is the most uncomfortable. American military and intelligence operations in post-war Southeast Asia were managing, among other things, the inherited chemical and biological weapon stockpiles of the defeated Japanese. This management was not always clean. It was not always official. The same intelligence apparatus that granted Ishii his immunity and absorbed his research data was also, in various documented and suspected operations, moving materials through the region in ways that required deniability. An unregistered ship, a crew hired without background checks, a cargo manifest that doesn't exist. This is not a description of careless criminal smuggling. This is a description of a covert operation. The CIA noting the Ourang Medan in a 1959 document, 12 years after the incident, is not the behavior of an agency looking at a colorful maritime legend. It is the behavior of an agency maintaining awareness of an incident that falls within its operational domain. The question of whether that awareness is because someone in that agency knew what was on that ship or knew who put it there is a question the document does not answer. There is one more detail from Mielke's 1954 booklet that deserves to stand on its own. The booklet states the Ourang Medan was sailing from an unspecified Chinese port toward Costa Rica, a destination on the other side of the Pacific through the Panama Canal in Central America. This is not a regional cargo run. This is a transoceanic delivery of chemicals that cannot be officially declared on a ship with no registry through the most surveilled shipping corridor in Southeast Asia. The scale of that operation, if it happened as described, is not small-time smuggling. The logistics of an unregistered transoceanic voyage in 1947 with a crew hired off books in Shanghai carrying 15,000 crates of undeclared chemical cargo is an operation that requires planning, financing, and connections that go beyond a couple of black market traders on a dock in Sumatra. Someone built this voyage. Someone funded it. Someone arranged the cargo. Someone hired the crew with the specific intention that the crew would not survive to talk about what they'd seen, or at minimum, with a reckless indifference to whether they did. The men who died on the Ourang Medan were not soldiers. They were not combatants. They were sailors, hired to move a ship from one place to another, who were either never told what was in the hold below their feet, or were told and had nowhere to go once they knew. The radio operator who stayed at his station and transmitted those final words, whatever was happening to him physiologically in those last seconds, understood enough to tell someone, to push the words out into the frequency while he still could. He just didn't know if anyone was listening, or if anyone who was listening would be allowed to act on what they heard. The Ourang Medan exploded before the Silver Star's boarding party could get back below decks, before anyone could open this, hold and photograph what was inside, before a single piece of cargo could be removed, examined, sampled, or documented. The ship sank in water deep enough that no salvage operation, then or since, has ever been attempted or confirmed. Everything in that hold went to the bottom with the ship, which is, depending on your view of how the world works, either the worst possible outcome for the truth, or exactly the outcome someone planned for. The sea keeps what you give it, and someone gave it everything. Let's say the ship was real. Let's say that somewhere in the administrative chaos of post-war Southeast Asia, in the gap between a collapsing Dutch colonial empire and a region reshaping itself under the twin pressures of decolonization and Cold War positioning, a vessel sailed through the Strait of Malacca in the summer of 1947, under a name it may have only recently acquired, carrying cargo it had every reason to keep undeclared, crewed by men who may or may not have known what was below their feet. Let's say all of that happened exactly as the most credible version of this story describes it. What we are left with is not a mystery in the supernatural sense. What we are left with is something considerably darker than that. We are left with a crime. Uncommitted by any named party, uninvestigated by any official body, unprosecuted in any court, unacknowledged by any government. A crime that killed every person on a ship, sank the evidence, and then, through a combination of deliberate record absence, post-war bureaucratic chaos, and the simple geographical mercy of deep water, disappeared so completely that 80 years later we are still arguing about whether the ship existed at all. That is not a mystery. That is impunity, perfected by the sea. Start with what we can actually verify. Draw the line clearly, because the Ourang Medan story has spent 80 years accumulating barnacles of speculation that make the genuine evidential core harder to see. The Silver Star existed, that is confirmed. It sailed the Strait of Malacca in 1947 under that name during the narrow window between its requisition by the U.S. Maritime Commission and its return to Grace Lines. The window fits. The vessel fits. The location fits. The story was documented by the United States Coast Guard in 1952. That is a fact. The Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council is not a tabloid. It is an official American government maritime publication, and it recorded this incident in its pages. Someone in an official capacity decided this event was worth documenting. That decision was made 5 years after the alleged incident, which means it was not an immediate news report or a reactive filing. Someone, 5 years later, still considered it worth putting on record. That is not the behavior of an institution filing away a sailor's yarn. The story appeared in a CIA-adjacent document in 1959. That is documented. What it means is debatable. That it exists is not. The chemicals identified in multiple independent sources, Otto Mielke's 1954 booklet, the De Lokomotiv survivor account, the earlier 1940 Italian version of the story, are consistent across accounts that have different origins, different authors, different languages, and different decades. Potassium cyanide, nitroglycerin, sulfuric acid. 3 sources, 3 languages, 3 separate decades, same chemicals. That consistency is not proof, but it is not nothing. The chemistry works. This is perhaps the most important verifiable fact in the entire case. The specific combination of potassium cyanide and sulfuric acid in the presence of seawater produces hydrogen cyanide gas. The symptoms of hydrogen cyanide poisoning match every physical detail found on every body on that ship. The instability of nitroglycerin under the conditions described explains the explosion. The endothermic phase of the cyanide reaction explains the cold. Science is not speculative. The science is settled. The only question is whether those chemicals were actually present. And 3 independent sources say they were. What cannot be verified: the ship's registry, the captain's name, the exact date, the precise location, the identity of the crew, the origin of the cargo, the destination, the party responsible for loading it. These are the gaps. They are large gaps. But they are also precisely the gaps you would expect if this ship was operating deliberately outside the official record. The absence of documentation for a vessel that had every reason to avoid documentation is not evidence of fabrication. It is exactly what fabrication avoidance looks like from the outside. Now the harder question, the one the evidence points toward but cannot fully answer: who built this voyage? The most intellectually honest answer, the one that accounts for all the verified details without overreaching into the unverifiable, looks something like this. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the waters of Southeast Asia were a transit zone for materials that powerful institutions needed to move without creating a paper trail. Japanese chemical and biological weapons stockpiles, post-Unit 731 research compounds, and associated materials were being dispersed across the Pacific under arrangements that combined American military intelligence oversight with the willing participation of former Japanese military networks operating in the post-war criminal economy. The Ourang Medan, or whatever the ship was actually called before it acquired that name, was likely part of this ecosystem. An unregistered vessel, crewed off the books in Shanghai or another Chinese port, loaded with chemical compounds whose combined presence in a ship's hold was not an accident or an act of careless smuggling. Someone who understood chemistry loaded that hold. Someone who understood that the specific combination of those compounds, improperly stowed or deliberately configured, would not leave survivors. Someone who understood that a ship with no registry, sailing to a destination as far as Costa Rica, would be very difficult to trace if it never arrived. Whether the crew were expendable from the beginning, hired with the understanding on someone's part that they would not return, or whether the deaths were the result of negligent stowage rather than deliberate intent, is something the evidence cannot resolve. The distinction matters morally, it matters less practically. Either way, 40 men died on a ship that nobody owned, carrying cargo that nobody declared, and nobody was ever held responsible for any of it. Roy Bainton, the British maritime historian who spent years chasing this story, arrived at a conclusion that is worth sitting with. He believed the ship was real. He believed the incident happened. He believed that the most likely explanation for the absence of official records was deliberate operational security. That the ship was kept out of the record on purpose, by people with the institutional capacity to do exactly that. And he believed that the story survived, in fragments and contradictions, because the people closest to it, the crew of the Silver Star, the missionaries who encountered the alleged survivor, the journalists who published the accounts, could not quite let it disappear entirely. Stories survive when someone needs them to. The Ourang Medan story survived because it kept finding mouths to travel through. An Italian journalist in wartime Trieste, a Dutch-Indonesian newspaper in post-war Batavia, an American Coast Guard publication in Cold War Washington, a German researcher in Essen who spent half a century refusing to let it die. Each of these tellings was imperfect. Each added something, changed something, lost something in translation or retelling. But the core, the signal, the dead crew, the frozen faces, the explosion, the sinking, the chemicals, that core held across 8 decades and half a dozen languages. The core held because it was true enough that no version of the story could fully dislodge it. Consider the geopolitics one more time, because they are not background here. They are the story. In 1947, the Dutch were fighting a colonial war to hold on to the Dutch East Indies, what would become Indonesia, against an independence movement that had declared itself the Republic of Indonesia in August 1945, 2 days after Japan's surrender. The Strait of Malacca was not a neutral waterway. It was a contested colonial corridor actively patrolled by Dutch naval vessels, monitored by British colonial intelligence from Malaya, and watched by an American intelligence apparatus that had significant strategic interests in how Southeast Asia reorganized itself in the early Cold War. An unregistered ship moving chemical cargo through that corridor was not moving through the empty ocean. It was moving through one of the most surveilled stretches of water in the world, at one of the most politically volatile moments in the history of the region. The idea that an incident of this scale, a ship found floating with its entire crew dead, boarded by an American vessel, witnessed by multiple parties, could be entirely suppressed requires not just the absence of records, but the active management of information by institutions with the capacity and motive to do exactly that. The U.S. Coast Guard documented it in 1952. Someone in American intelligence noted it in 1959, and then, officially, it went nowhere. No investigation, no finding, no named responsible party, no acknowledgement from any Dutch, British, American, or Indonesian authority that anything happened at all. In the early Cold War, the management of what was and was not officially known about post-war weapons dispersal was not a peripheral concern of major intelligence services. It was a central one. The Americans had made explicit deals, Ishi's immunity being the most documented, to obtain weapons research data in exchange for protection from accountability. Acknowledging a ship full of dead sailors killed by illegally transported chemical compounds in a Dutch colonial waterway in 1947 would have required answering questions about whose compounds they were, who authorized the transport, and what the destination was. Those answers connected to things that powerful institutions in 1947, 1952, and 1959 were not prepared to make public. So they didn't. The sea helped. It always helps. A ship that sinks in deep water takes everything with it. Manifests, logbooks, physical evidence, the bodies themselves. The sea doesn't just keep secrets. It erases the physical substrate that secrets require to be contested. Without the ship, without the cargo, without the bodies, the entire incident exists only in the accounts of people who can be dismissed, in records that can be disputed, in a story that mutates with each retelling until it sounds, to an uninformed listener, exactly like a legend. That's not an accident. That is the mechanism. That is how this kind of truth gets buried. Not in a single deliberate act of suppression, but in the accumulated weight of official silence, convenient absence, and the natural human tendency to dismiss what cannot be cleanly proven. There is one more thing to reckon with before this ends. The radio operator. We keep coming back to him because he is the human center of this entire story. He is the last conscious person on that ship. He is the person who, in the final seconds of his life, chose to stay at his station rather than run, or couldn't run, which amounts to the same thing. He is the person who reduced everything that was happening to him and around him down to the 2 most precise words available. I die. Now we are dying. Not send help, not a position, not a ship name, not a request, just the first person singular, present, continuous, and the verb. A statement of fact delivered with the economy of someone who knows they have very little time and chooses to spend it telling the truth rather than asking for something that isn't coming. Think about what it takes to do that. Think about what is happening in his body in those seconds. The hydrogen cyanide moving through the ventilation, the cellular respiration failing, the muscles beginning to lock. Think about the choice, conscious or instinctive, to transmit rather than flee. To put the words out into the frequency even knowing, because he has just transmitted that his captain is dead, his officers are dead, his crew is dead, that there is almost certainly no one left on this ship to help him. He sent those words to the people outside the ship, for the ships receiving on that frequency, for whoever was listening in the strait. He sent them because he understood that what was happening on the Ourang Medan was not supposed to happen, and that someone outside those metal walls should know. He was right that someone should know. He was wrong, or at least unlucky, about whether it would matter. The Ourang Medan exploded and sank in the summer of 1947. Whatever is left of it is somewhere on the floor of the Strait of Malacca or the South Pacific. The exact location depending on which version of the story you trust. In water deep enough that it has never been found, never been identified, never been examined by any team with the equipment and authorization to say definitively, here is the ship, here is the hold, here is what killed them. In 80 years, no government has claimed it. No insurance company has filed on it. No shipping registry has acknowledged it. No port has produced a record of it entering or leaving. No nation has named its crew. No memorial carries their names. No official investigation has ever been opened, closed, or even announced. The people who died on that ship have no country. They have no flag. They have no record. They are officially people who never existed, dying on a ship that never sailed, in an incident that never happened. They are the most completely erased victims of an undeclared crime in the history of maritime law. And the last thing any of them did, the last act of the last living person among them, was reach for a transmitter and try to tell someone. That act of witness, 2 words punched into a Morse key in a tropical corridor filling with invisible gas, is the only reason we are talking about this 80 years later. It is the crack in the erasure, the thing that didn't sink with the ship. Because you can sink steel and you can sink cargo and you can sink bodies and you can sink every manifest and logbook and registry entry you ever had, but you can't sink a signal that was already received. Those 2 words went out across the water and into the ears of men on other ships who wrote them down. And they kept getting written down and written down again. In Italian, Dutch, German, and English, in wartime and peacetime and the Cold War, in newspapers and magazines and government publications and academic booklets, and now, here, 80 years later, in whatever form this story reaches you. I die. 2 words. No name, no flag, no record, no country, no justice. Exactly how someone wanted it, but not entirely, not finally. How it ended up. The SS Ourang Medan has never been officially confirmed to have existed. No registry holds its name. No investigation has ever been opened. No government has ever acknowledged the incident. The United States Coast Guard documented it in 1952. An American intelligence document referenced it in 1959. The chemistry of the cargo described by 3 independent sources across 3 decades is consistent with every physical detail found by the boarding party. The bodies have never been examined. The ship has never been located. Nobody has ever been held responsible for the 40 men who died on it. The case is officially closed. It was never officially opened.